They say the desert doesn't lie. It strips you bare of all pretense, bleaches your bones of anything but the truth. I've spent my whole life listening to it, understanding its whispers in the wind and its roars in a flash flood. But there are some truths the land keeps hidden, buried deep in its red clay and sagebrush. I was just a man trying to hold onto a piece of ground that was never truly mine, a rancher whose greatest battles were against drought and rust. I thought I knew all about hardship. I was wrong. I was about to learn that the most profound pain, the kind that seeps into your soul and changes the very color of your world, doesn't always have a name. Sometimes, it's just a cry carried on the wind, a small voice calling for a mother who will never answer. The sun wasn't just hot that day. It was a living thing, a predator with teeth of light that sank into the back of my neck and chewed on my sanity. I'd been out since before dawn, checking the fence line along the eastern ridge. A wildfire had swept through 3 years back, and the land was still healing, throwing up new growth that was tough and stubborn, just like the people who tried to live on it. My horse, a Grulla gelding named Dusty with a disposition as sour as week-old milk, plodded along the trail, his ears flicking back and forth with a disinterest that mirrored my own. I was a man of routine. It was the only way to survive out here. Wake up, coffee black and bitter, mend something, check something, watch the sun crawl across the sky like a lazy spider and try to keep the ghosts of the past from whispering too loud. My wife Clara had been gone 5 years now. She loved the desert, said it was honest. I just found it lonely. Her absence was a constant hum beneath the silence, a low-frequency drone that I'd learned to live with, like the ache in my old knee when a storm was coming. The work was my anchor. The constant need to fix a broken gate, find a stray cow, or check the water troughs kept my mind from wandering into the dangerous territory of memory. I kept my head down, my hands busy, and my heart locked in a box buried deep in my chest. That was the plan anyway. That plan fell apart on a Tuesday afternoon, right around 4 o'clock, when the heat was at its most malicious, and the only sound was the buzzing of 1,000 invisible flies. I was about a mile from the old line shack, a crumbling stone structure my grandfather had built, when I heard it. At first it was just a wisp of sound, a thread of noise so thin and reedy I thought it was the wind playing tricks on me. I reined Dusty in, tilting my head to listen. The silence rushed back in, thick and heavy, but my heart had already started to beat a little faster. That was the thing about the desert. You learned to trust its cadence, the rhythm of its breath. When that rhythm was broken, something was wrong. Then I heard it again. It was a cry, but not like any I'd ever heard from an animal. It was human. A high, thin, keening wail that sliced through the oppressive heat and went straight into my chest. It was a sound of sheer, unfiltered terror, a primal scream from a throat that was raw and on the verge of giving out. Mama, mama. A child. My blood turned to ice. I'd heard many things out here, the scream of a mountain lion, the yip of a coyote, the death rattle of a calf. I'd even heard a man's dying breath once, a sound I'd tried to forget. But this was different. This was the sound of a world collapsing. It was the sound of innocence being stripped away in a brutal, unforgiving landscape. "Hello," I shouted, the word feeling foreign and clumsy in my dry throat. "Hello, you okay?" The only response was another frantic cry, closer this time, coming from a thicket of thorny mesquite and cholla cactus that bordered a dry arroyo. I dismounted, my joints protesting the sudden movement. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on my shoulders. I looped Dusty's reins around a sturdy-looking creosote bush and started forward, pushing through the tangle of brush. The thorns snagged at my shirt, drawing thin lines of blood on my arms. And then I saw her. She was a tiny thing, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, with a mop of tangled black hair and skin the color of warm clay. She was wearing a simple cotton dress, now dirty and torn, and one of her small feet was bare. She was sitting on the ground, her back against a boulder, clutching her left leg. It was bent at an unnatural angle, the skin already beginning to swell and darken with a deep, ugly bruise. A broken bone. My stomach lurched. Her face was a mask of pure misery. Tears had carved clean paths through the dust and grime on her cheeks, but she'd been crying so hard, they'd dried into salty, shiny streaks. Her large, dark eyes were wide with a terror that went beyond simple pain. They were the eyes of a creature that had been backed into a corner and had accepted the inevitable. She was alone, and she was frightened. When she saw me, the sound changed. The desperate cry for her mother stopped, replaced by a choked sob, a tiny, heart-wrenching sound that was full of both relief and renewed fear. She pressed herself back against the rock as if she could disappear into it. "Whoa there," I said, my voice softening to a tone I hadn't used in years. It was the voice I used to soothe a frightened colt. "It's okay, little one. I'm not gonna hurt you." I held my hands up, palms out, a gesture of peace. I was a big man, made bigger by the layers of denim and leather I wore to protect myself from the sun and the brush. I must have looked like a giant to her. "Mama," she whimpered again, her eyes searching my face, looking for something familiar. "She's not here, is she?" I said, the question a quiet confirmation of a terrible truth. There was no camp, no wagon, no sign of anyone else for miles. A girl this small couldn't have been lost for long in this heat. My mind started to race, conjuring up terrible possibilities. A horse accident, an attack by a mountain lion, the sudden, violent arrival of a flash flood. She could have been separated from her family, or she could be the only one left. I inched closer. "My name's Cal Vance," I said, tapping my chest. "I have a ranch not too far from here. Can you tell me your name?" She just stared, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The pain in her leg was clearly intense. I could see her fighting it, trying to be brave, but a small whimper escaped her lips every time she moved. All right," I murmured, kneeling down a few feet away from her, ignoring the sharp sting of a cactus spine that found its way through my jeans. "The first thing we gotta do is get you some water. You look as dry as a creek bed in August." I unclipped my canteen, the metal scalding to the touch, and poured a little water into the metal cup that was attached to it. I held it out to her. "It's just water, see? Plain and simple." She looked from the cup to my face and back again, her terror warring with a thirst that had to be consuming her. I'd seen that look in animals before, the wild, desperate look of a creature forced to trust its worst enemy. Her small hand shot out, snatched the cup, and she drank. She guzzled it down with a desperate greed that worried me. I let her finish before saying, "Easy now, slow and steady." She handed the cup back and I refilled it, giving it to her a second time. This time, she sipped at it, her eyes never leaving mine. I could see the gears turning in her head, trying to decide if she was safe. "I know you're scared," I said, my voice low and rhythmic. "And I know you're hurting. That's a nasty break you got there, but I can't stay here with you forever. The sun's gonna go down soon, and that's when it gets cold. We have to get you back to my place, get you warm, and get your leg looked at." I saw a fresh wave of panic flash in her eyes. "Can you stand?" I asked, making a move to stand up myself. The thought of moving her was horrifying. A broken leg needed a splint, and I had nothing to make one with. But staying here was a death sentence. Hypothermia in the desert night would be just as deadly as the heat of the day. She shook her head frantically, a new tear escaping and tracing a clean path down her cheek. "I can't," she whispered. It was the first full word she'd said to me. The voice was so small, so weak, it made my heart ache. Okay, I said, my mind working furiously. I couldn't carry her all the way back to the ranch. The terrain was too rough and I was too old. Dusty was my only option. "I'm going to have to lift you. I'm going to pick you up and put you on my horse. It'll hurt. I won't lie to you, but it'll only be for a moment. You ready?" She didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on me, filled with fear and a terrible, fragile trust. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. I had to be quick and as gentle as I possibly could be. "All right, here we go, on 3, 1, 2. On 2, I moved. I scooped her up as gently as I could, cradling her injured leg with one arm, trying not to jar it. She screamed. It was a sharp, piercing shriek of agony that seemed to hang in the air, shimmering in the heat. She went limp in my arms, her body fainting from the sudden pain. Good. It was better this way. I carried her back to Dusty, who was watching us with a wary, rolling eye. "Stand still, you old goat," I muttered, adjusting the girl in my arms. Getting her onto the saddle was a challenge, made worse by the fact that she was unconscious and my arms were burning with the effort. But I managed it, settling her across the saddle horn so she was lying sideways, her head resting against my chest. I climbed up behind her, my heart hammering against my ribs. Her head was lolling, her face pale and beaded with sweat. I wrapped one arm securely around her, holding her in place, and used my other hand to guide Dusty back towards the ranch. "Dusty," I said, my voice tight, "we gotta get home, fast as you can, but don't you dare jostle her." The horse sensed my urgency and picked up the pace. The ride back was a blur of agony and fear. I kept talking to her, even though she was unconscious, telling her everything was going to be all right, that she was safe, that I was taking her home. I realized I was trying to comfort myself as much as her. The weight of her in my arms felt strange. It was a weight I wasn't used to, a living, breathing fragility that I was wholly responsible for. It was Clara's weight, the weight of a person you die for, and it scared me more than any drought or fire ever had. The silence of my life had just been shattered, and in its place was a terrifying new sound, the quiet, ragged breathing of a small, unknown girl who was now entirely dependent on me. It was a sound that broke down the door to my carefully guarded heart. The ride back to the ranch felt like it took a lifetime. The sun was beginning its slow, lazy descent towards the mountains, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and angry orange. It was a beautiful sunset, the kind that usually made me stop and appreciate the simple magnificence of the world. Today, I couldn't have cared less. My mind was consumed by the small, limp form in my arms. She was so light, so terribly fragile, like a bird with a broken wing that had fallen from its nest. I kept a hand on her pulse at her neck, a constant, terrified reassurance that she was still with me. It was a thin, rapid flutter like a hummingbird's heartbeat. Her face was slack and pale, but the tears had left their mark in the grime. The bruise on her leg was spreading, turning a hideous shade of purple and black. It was clear she needed more help than I could provide. I wasn't a doctor. The only medical knowledge I had was what I'd picked up from patching up myself and my hands over the years. How to stitch a cut, how to set a simple fracture, and how to tell when a fever was about to get dangerous. This was beyond that. As I crested the final rise and saw my home in the valley below, a wave of relief washed over me. It was a modest place, a two-room cabin built from pine logs that my father had dragged down from the mountains a lifetime ago. A barn stood 100 yards away, and a corral surrounded the house. There was no doctor within 50 miles. The nearest town, Pinedale, was a day's ride away. There was no telegraph, no telephone. It was just me, a half-dead girl, and the encroaching night. The decision was immediate and absolute. I had to splint her leg tonight. If I waited until morning, the damage would be worse. I could only hope her bones were cleanly broken and that there was no internal damage. I was going to have to do it myself. The thought terrified me more than facing a stampede. I rode Dusty right up to the cabin door, leaving him there and carrying the girl inside. The cabin was cool and dim, the remnants of the fire I'd built that morning still smoldering in the hearth. I laid her down on the worn leather sofa, which was the most comfortable thing I owned. Her head lolled to one side, and I was grateful she was still unconscious. I didn't want her to feel what came next. I worked with a frantic, desperate energy. I gathered everything I could think of: a clean linen sheet to tear into strips, 2 thick, straight pieces of wood from a pile I kept for kindling, a blanket, and a whiskey bottle. I cleaned my hunting knife with the whiskey, the sharp, antiseptic smell filling the small room. I was in a state of controlled panic, my hands moving with a precision born of pure adrenaline. This was the first time I'd let myself truly look at her. Her hair was matted and filthy. Her dress was torn, revealing a small, bony shoulder. She was dreadfully thin, and it wasn't just from being lost for a day. This was a child who was used to going hungry. Her skin was dark and her hair black as pitch, and I knew immediately she wasn't from around here. There were no Apache families in this area, no tribes anywhere close. The few I'd ever encountered were further south or in the mountains. How had she come to be here? Where was her family? The questions were like a swarm of wasps in my head, but I pushed them aside. First, I had to save her. I carefully cut away the torn fabric of her dress from her injured leg, my heart sinking at the sight. The leg was swollen to nearly twice its normal size, the skin stretched tight and shiny. It was a clean break, I could see that now, a fracture in the middle of her shin. I could see the outline of the bone beneath the skin, a horrifying, unnatural bump. "All right," I whispered to myself, my hands trembling slightly. "Like a calf, treat it like a calf." I took a deep breath, then another. My thoughts were scattered, but I forced them into a narrow focus. I lined up the 2 pieces of wood along either side of her leg. I knew I had to pull the leg straight to set the bone. It was the most barbaric part. I had a rope on the floor. I secured her foot to a heavy table leg with a length of rope, then held her knee down with my own body weight. I took the ends of the wood and the strips of linen in my hands. "For Clara," I muttered, as if it were a prayer. Clara had been a nurse in the war. She told me stories of field hospitals, of the terrible things she'd seen and done. She'd had a strength I'd never possessed. I drew on it now, pulling from a well of memory I thought had run dry. I saw her hands, steady and sure, as she'd shown me how to set a splint on a dog that had been hit by a wagon. "Don't be afraid. It's just a bone." I gritted my teeth and began. I pulled the leg straight, a sickening, grinding feeling traveling up my hands. The girl whimpered in her sleep, her face contorting in pain. I worked as fast as I could, binding the wood to her leg with the strips of linen, making it as tight and secure as possible. I was sweating, my shirt clinging to my back. When I was done, I sat back on my heels, my body trembling. A bloody, dark bruise was beginning to appear on her ankle. I'd done what I could. It was a crude, brutal solution, but it was all I had. I cleaned the wound as best I could with the whiskey, which she flinched at even in her unconscious state, and then wrapped the leg in a clean cloth. I covered her with the blanket, my hands lingering for a moment on the blanket's edge. She was so small, so utterly lost. I don't know how long I sat there just watching her. The silence of the cabin was oppressive, broken only by the crackle of the fire and her soft, uneven breathing. I was completely at a loss. I had no idea who she was, where she'd come from, or if her family was out there searching for her. I felt a rising tide of panic and helplessness. I was just a rancher. I knew how to herd cattle and mend fences. I didn't know how to care for a child. I got up and made coffee, more for something to do than for the drink. I paced the cabin, my anxiety growing with every passing minute. As the minutes turned into an hour, she began to stir. Her eyelids fluttered, and she let out a small moan. "Hey," I said, crossing the room and kneeling by the sofa. "It's okay, you're safe." Her eyes opened. They were dark and wide, filled with the same terror I'd seen in the arroyo, but now it was mixed with confusion. She looked around the cabin, her gaze darting from the fireplace to the windows to the rough-hewn walls. She was trying to piece together where she was. "SHH," I said softly, holding up a hand. "You're at my cabin, Cal, remember? I found you out in the desert." Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I saw a flicker of recognition. Then her bottom lip began to tremble. "Mama," she whispered. Her voice was so small, so broken. I shook my head, my heart aching for her. "No, honey, it's just me. I'm all there is." The tremble turned into a sob, a small, pathetic sound that broke something inside me. She tried to sit up to look for her mother, but the pain in her leg stopped her. She cried out, a sharp gasp of pain, and collapsed back onto the sofa. The tears came freely then, great, heaving sobs that shook her entire tiny frame. I didn't know what to do. I was terrified of hurting her, of making things worse. I hesitated for a moment, then, on a whim, I reached out and awkwardly patted her shoulder. "Hey now, hey," I murmured, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. "It's gonna be okay, you're safe now. I won't let anything hurt you." She was sobbing so hard she couldn't catch her breath. Her small fists were clenched against her chest. I had no idea how to comfort a child. But then a memory surfaced. Clara, soothing a calf that had lost its mother, her low, humming voice. I started to hum, a low, monotonous tone, the same tune she'd used. It was a simple, wordless melody that had always seemed to calm animals. It seemed to work on her too. Her sobs began to subside. She sniffled, her breathing still ragged, but she looked up at me. There was a deep, profound sadness in her eyes, but also a flicker of something else. Curiosity. "My name," I said slowly, pointing at my chest. "Cow." I pointed at her. "What's your name?" She stared at me for a long moment. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Shah." "Shah," I repeated, trying to pronounce it. It was a soft, almost musical word, like a sigh. She nodded, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. "Well, Shah," I said, forcing a small smile. "I'm glad to meet you. It's a pleasure." She looked at me, her brow furrowed. There was no understanding, just a deep, bottomless sorrow. Her mother was gone. She was in a strange man's house, in a world she didn't understand, with a broken leg and a heart full of grief. I felt a profound sense of inadequacy wash over me. I was a lone, aging rancher who hadn't spoken to anyone in a week. What was I going to do with her? The weight of the responsibility settled on my shoulders, a suffocating cloak of fear and obligation. I got up and poured a cup of coffee, handing it to her. She took it, her small hands wrapping around the warmth of the cup. She didn't drink, just held it, as if the warmth itself was a comfort. I watched her, noticing the way she stared at the fire, the way she clutched the blanket around her. The fear hadn't left her eyes. It had just been buried for a moment by the simple miracle of being alive and warm. The question of her family was a dark cloud on the horizon. Was there a mother somewhere frantic with worry, a father, a village? The thought of her being the only survivor of some terrible tragedy was too much to bear. I pushed the thought away. I had to focus on the here and now. I had to keep her alive. It was a goal, a purpose. It was the first one I'd had in a long time. As the fire crackled, I realized my life, which had been a quiet, predictable pattern of work and solitude, had been irrevocably and violently changed. The silence that had felt so comfortable, so secure, was now the enemy. In its place was a fragile, precious, terrifying responsibility. Her name was Shia, and I had no idea what her fate was going to be. But I was determined to be a part of it. The thought was both exhilarating and utterly terrifying. The next few days were a brutal education. I was a student in a class I never signed up for, with a teacher who spoke a language I didn't understand and had suffered a trauma I couldn't comprehend. The lessons were harsh. How to change a dressing on a tiny, feverish leg. How to coax a stubborn, grieving child to eat a few spoonfuls of broth. How to interpret a series of grunts, tears, and silences. It was a master class in patience, a virtue I had always prided myself on, but was quickly realizing I possessed only a novice's understanding of. Shah's fever came on the second night. I woke to find her burning up, her skin dry and hot to the touch, her tiny body shaking with chills. I spent the night by her side, soaking cloths in cold water and pressing them to her forehead, speaking to her in a low, soothing voice that felt like a lie to my own ears. I was terrified. I knew what a fever could do to a child. It could burn out their life in a matter of hours. I'd seen it happen to a foal in the spring. The image of the little creature's glazed, lifeless eyes was branded into my memory. The fever raged for 3 days. On the second day she began to talk in her delirium. It wasn't English. It was a series of fluid, guttural words, a language that painted pictures in my mind. She spoke of a river, a place with tall trees, a woman with a gentle laugh. She was calling for her mother again, her voice a desperate, frantic whisper that cut me to the bone. I held her hand, feeling her small, hot fingers clutch mine with a strength I didn't think she possessed. I squeezed back, offering her whatever anchor I could provide in her swirling nightmare. I started talking to her, telling her about my life. I told her about Clara, about the day we'd met at a harvest dance, about the way she'd laughed at my terrible dancing. I told her about the ranch, about the stubborn cattle and the even more stubborn land. I talked until my voice was hoarse, hoping that the sound of my voice, a steady rhythm in the chaos, would somehow reach her. It was a selfish act, I suppose. I was trying to keep my own fear at bay, to fill the oppressive silence with a noise that wasn't the sound of her struggling to breathe. On the fourth day, her fever broke. It was a slow, gradual process, but I could see the change in her. The flush receded from her cheeks, her breathing evened out, and she slept a deep, natural sleep. I sat beside her, bone-tired, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest. The relief was so profound, my knees went weak. I was shaking, tears pricking at my eyes. In that moment, I understood what love at first sight meant. It wasn't about passion. It was about the terrifying, soul-deep realization that your world had just become irrevocably linked to another's, and you would move heaven and earth to keep that person safe. When she woke, she was weak and disoriented, but her eyes were clear. She looked at me, and there was no fear this time, just a deep, quiet weariness. I gave her water and some broth, which she drank slowly. She tried to speak, a single word in her own language, a question. I shook my head, my vocabulary limited to the one word she'd taught me. "I don't understand," I said. "I'm sorry." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she reached out and touched my face. Her small hand was cool against my stubbled cheek. It was a gesture of curiosity, of assessment. She was trying to understand me, just as I was trying to understand her. The loneliness was a palpable thing in the room. I could feel it radiating from her, a cold, quiet ache. It made me think of myself, the way I felt after Clara died, the way my world had shrunk to the size of my ranch, the way I'd stopped allowing myself to feel. Shah wasn't just lost, she had been severed from her entire world. She was a branch snapped from a tree, a seed carried by the wind to barren ground. I had to help her take root. The day after her fever broke, I decided it was time to try and reach out. I was a rancher, not a diplomat. My social skills were rusty at best, but the silence between us was a wall, and I needed to find a way through it. I started simple. I pointed at things and said their name in English. "Door," I said, pointing. "Window, fire." She would stare at me, her eyes following my finger. Sometimes she would repeat the word back to me, her pronunciation clumsy, but a spark of comprehension in her eyes. It was a game, a small, tentative bridge across the chasm of our differences. Then one morning, she pointed at a cup and said, "Two." I frowned. I had no idea what that meant. She said it again, more insistently, pointing at the cup. Then she pointed at a book. "Two." My mind raced. Was she asking if it was mine? Was she asking what it was for? I felt a surge of frustration. The words were there, the meaning was dancing just out of reach. I took a deep breath and tried a different tactic. I picked up a wooden spoon. "Spoon," I said, tapping it. I pointed at her. "Two." She shook her head, but she wasn't giving up. She looked around the room, and her eyes landed on a small, worn photograph of Clara I kept on the mantel. She pointed at it, and then at me. "She." The world seemed to narrow to a single point. Her word for mother. I looked at the picture. Clara. This woman was she. A wave of something cold washed over me. "No," I said, the word feeling sharp and jagged. I shook my head. I picked up the picture and showed it to her. "No, Shah, this is Clara. She was my wife." I tapped my own chest. I didn't know the word for wife. I just said mine. Then I pointed at her. "Where is your mother? Where is your she?" Her face crumpled. The small, fragile connection we'd been building seemed to shatter in an instant. A tear leaked from the corner of her eye and traced a slow path down her cheek. She didn't make a sound. The silent grief was far worse than any scream. She just stared at me, her eyes filled with a bottomless, terrible sorrow. And then, for the first time, she responded in English. "Gone," she whispered, "she gone." 2 words, 2 simple, devastating words that carried the weight of an entire world. The truth, in all its brutal, final clarity, hung in the air between us. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a guess. She knew. Her mother was dead. The room seemed to constrict. I felt a tightness in my chest, a pang of shared grief so acute it stole my breath. All the questions I had been suppressing came rushing back, but they were unimportant now. The answer to one of them, the most important one, was already here, sitting in front of me in the form of this small, shattered girl. She was an orphan. She was utterly, completely alone. I didn't know what to do. I felt a knot of emotion in my throat. I looked at the picture of Clara and I understood the terror in Shia's eyes on a level I hadn't before. I had lost a wife. She had lost a mother. Our loneliness was not the same, but it echoed. Without thinking, I reached out and put my hand on her head, my fingers gently stroking her tangled hair. It was an awkward, clumsy gesture. I was a man who had spent his whole life dealing with animals, not feelings. But it was the only thing I knew to do. She didn't pull away. She just sat there, trembling as the tears finally began to flow, silent and hot against her cheeks. In that moment, she wasn't just a responsibility anymore. She wasn't just a girl I was trying to keep alive. She was a mirror, reflecting my own pain back at me, making me feel my own loneliness for the first time in years. And it was unbearable. I knew then, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that my fate and hers were now tangled together. The next few days were a quiet truce. She was still frightened, still deep in her grief, but a fragile trust was starting to take hold. She began to eat more, her appetite returning slowly. She would watch me work with a quiet intensity, her eyes following my every move. I built a splint for her leg, a better one, with some leather padding I'd found in the barn. I showed her the small herd of cattle in the corral, and for the first time, a tiny smile flickered on her face when a calf came up to the fence to sniff at her fingers. It was the first time I'd seen her smile. It was a fleeting thing, a ghost of an expression, but it was enough. It was a victory, a small crack in the wall of her grief. It was a glimpse of the person she might become if she could survive this, and it made me want to fight even harder for her. The nights were the hardest. The darkness brought back her fear. She would wake up screaming, calling for her mother, her small body racked with sobs. I would go to her, sit on the floor by her side, and talk to her in my low, rumbling voice. I told her about the stars, about the constellations I knew, about the stories of the cowboys who had come before me. I kept my voice steady and calm, the sound a bulwark against the terrors of the night. One night, after a particularly bad nightmare, she reached out for me. Her small hand found my own in the dark, and she didn't let go. We sat there in the silent, moonlit cabin, her hand in mine. It was a simple gesture, but it was more than trust. It was a plea. It was a connection. It was a fragile, new beginning. The silence I'd found so comfortable just a few weeks ago was now a different kind of silence. It was a silence filled with the echo of her nightmares, the sounds of her breathing, the rustle of her blanket. My quiet, predictable life had been replaced by chaos and fear, and a love I didn't know I was capable of. I had to get her to town, to a real doctor, but I was afraid. I was afraid of what I might find out, of the questions that would be asked, of the chance she would be taken away from me. The thought of losing her was a physical ache in my chest. I was no longer just a rancher named Cal Vance. I was a protector, a father in all but name, and I was determined to see this through, no matter what. A month had passed since I found Shia in that thorny arroyo. The days had taken on a new rhythm, a melody composed of her quiet humming, the clinking of my coffee cup, and the steady, reassuring sounds of the ranch. I'd taken to calling her Little Star sometimes, a clumsy translation of her name, and it always earned me a small, shy smile. Her leg was healing well, though she still walked with a pronounced limp. I taught her a few more English words, and she in turn had taught me a few of hers. We were building a small, shared vocabulary of our own, a language forged in necessity and trust. But I knew this fragile piece couldn't last. The question of her origins, her future, was a storm cloud on the horizon. I had a responsibility to her, one that extended beyond feeding her and making sure her leg healed. She was a child, lost and alone, and she deserved more than the protection of a lonely, aging rancher. She deserved a chance at a real life, a life with people who understood her, a life with a culture she could be part of. But I was terrified of what that chance would cost me. The decision to take her to Pinedale wasn't a choice, it was an inevitability. My supplies were running low, and more than that, she needed to see a real doctor. Her limp was getting worse, not better, and I was plagued by the fear that I'd botched the splint, that I'd caused permanent damage. But the bigger fear was the law, the authorities. A white man with an orphaned Apache girl. The questions would be endless, the suspicion sharp and constant. I could lose her. The thought was like a cold hand gripping my heart. The morning we left, the air was crisp and clean, a welcome relief from the heavy heat of the past weeks. I hitched Dusty to the wagon, a battered old thing that was more patch than wood. I'd cleaned the cabin from top to bottom, made the bed and banked the fire as if I were leaving for a day, not a lifetime. I helped Shea into the wagon, arranging the blankets around her leg. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and questioning. "Where we go?" she asked, her English halting but clear. "Town," I said, forcing a smile that felt like a grimace. "We have to see a doctor, get your leg looked at." Her brow furrowed and a flicker of fear passed through her eyes. She didn't say anything, but I saw her small hand reach out and take a fistful of my shirt, holding on tight. The gesture was so poignant, so full of silent fear, it almost undid me. The ride to Pinedale was a long, quiet one. I kept up a stream of chatter, pointing out things I thought she might find interesting. A flock of birds, a distant mountain peak, a jackrabbit darting across the trail. She listened, her head resting on the side of the wagon, her eyes taking in the unfamiliar landscape. The silence between my words was filled with my own anxiety, a low hum of dread that grew louder with every turn of the wheel. As we entered the outskirts of town, I saw the familiar buildings, the general store, the saloon, the blacksmiths. It was a small, dusty town, but to my eyes it felt like a bustling city. The smell of horses and dry earth was replaced by the smell of wood smoke and cooking food. Shah sat up, her curiosity piqued. She had never seen anything like it. I pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the doctor's office, a small clapboard building with a faded sign. My hands were sweating. This was it, the moment I'd been dreading. I helped Shea down from the wagon and we walked into the office. The waiting room was small and smelled of antiseptic. A man in a clean white shirt, the doctor, looked up from his desk. He was a thin, balding man with a neatly trimmed beard and a pair of wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. He looked at me, then his eyes fell on Shea. A flicker of surprise crossed his face, then a look of professional interest. "Well now," he said, his voice gentle, "what have we got here?" "Found her out in the desert about a month ago," I said, my voice gruff. "Broken leg. I put a splint on it, but it's not healing right." He nodded, his eyes on Shea, who was pressing herself against my leg, her hand clutching my belt. "Hello there," he said to her, his voice soft and inviting. "I'm Dr. Morrison. I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't respond. She just stared at him, her expression a mask of terrified suspicion. The doctor was patient. He knelt down, his movements slow and deliberate. "Can I see your leg?" he asked, pointing at her foot. She looked at me, her eyes questioning. I nodded, giving her a small, encouraging smile. He examined her leg with surprising gentleness. He unwrapped the bandages I'd put on, his brow furrowing as he studied the wound. He poked and prodded gently, and she winced but didn't cry out. He looked up at me, his expression serious. "Come into my office," he said. "I want to talk to you." I looked at Shea. "Stay here, honey," I said. "I'll be right back." Her eyes widened in panic, but she nodded, her small body trembling as she sat down on the worn wooden bench. In his office, Dr. Morrison closed the door. He removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. "I'm going to be honest with you, Mr. Vance," he said. "There's a piece of bone fragment, a splinter, that's wedged in the muscle. It's been aggravated by her movement. I can remove it, but it'll require a procedure. She'll be laid up for a few weeks." I felt a wave of relief. It wasn't permanent damage, it was fixable. Do it, I said, whatever it takes. He nodded. But Mr. Vance, he said, his voice lowering, there's another matter. She's obviously Apache, and she's obviously yours in a manner of speaking. The people in town will see her, they'll talk. The marshal is going to want to ask questions. There are concerns. I'd known this was coming. I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. I found her alone. Her mother is dead. She has no one. The doctor looked at me, a long, searching look. Is that what you're going to tell the marshal? He asked. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The truth was a tangled knot of grief and loneliness. Shia was a ghost in my life, a haunting presence I had grown to love, and I had no right to keep her. The procedure was quick and uneventful. Dr. Morrison worked with a quiet, assured competence, and Shia was asleep for the worst of it. When she woke, she was groggy, her leg bandaged tightly. The doctor had given me a list of instructions and some medicine. I was told to bring her to the office to see him every day for a week. We can talk more about her situation later, he said, his eyes holding mine. It's not something you can solve today. As I was carrying Shia out to the wagon, a man in a tan uniform approached me. He had a star pinned to his chest and a stern, weathered face. Mr. Vance, he said, I'm Marshal Gordon. I understand you've got an Apache girl. My heart sank. She's with me, I said, my voice tight. She's been with me for a month. I'd like to ask you a few questions, he said, about how you came to have her. She's a ward of the state, you understand. It's complicated. I knew exactly what he meant. She was a piece of property, a problem to be solved. The law would see her as a lost child to be placed in an institution, a symbol of the wild and savage world that was being tamed. It was a world that had no place for a girl like Shea. Can she stay with me? I asked, the question a desperate plea. Until she's better. The marshal looked at me for a long moment. He seemed to be weighing something. I'll have to talk to the judge, he said, but for now she can stay. Relief washed over me, so powerful it left me dizzy. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I helped Shea into the wagon, my hands trembling. I had bought us time, but the battle was far from over. The next few weeks were a blur of doctors' visits and tense silences. I had to convince the town, the marshal, the judge, that I was the best person for her. I had to prove I wasn't just a lonely man who had found a stray. I had to show them that I had the resources, the patience, and the love to raise her. It was a task that felt impossible. I would sit in the waiting room of the doctor's office while Shea had her treatments, my mind a whirlwind of anxiety and fear. I would watch the people in town, the way their eyes slid over Shea, the way they whispered behind their hands. I had to make them understand. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, I was sitting with Shea on the porch of the cabin. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. She was sitting on a chair, her bad leg propped up on a stool. She was quiet, her eyes distant. "Are you scared, little star?" I asked. She turned to look at me, her expression serious. "You are," she said. It wasn't a question, it was an observation. I let out a slow breath. "Yeah," I admitted, "I am." "Why?" she asked. I thought about it. How could I explain the complex fear of losing her, the terror of failing her, the loneliness that would follow if she was taken away? I tried to find the words. "I'm scared you'll be taken away from me," I said, my voice raw. She looked at me and I saw an old, familiar sorrow in her eyes, a sorrow that had nothing to do with me. "She gone," she said, repeating the words she'd said in the cabin. "You not gone." I looked at her, this small, brave, tragic girl. I felt a sudden, fierce protectiveness. I reached out and took her hand. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, the words a promise, a vow. "I'm not going to leave you." She looked at me for a long moment. Then, a slow, beautiful smile spread across her face. It was a smile that lit up her eyes, that chased away the shadows. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I knew then that I would fight for her. I would fight the town, the judge, the whole world if I had to. She was my responsibility, my reason, my redemption. The quiet, lonely rancher who had lost his wife and found a purpose in a tiny, broken Apache girl. The cowboy who had changed her fate and in doing so had changed his own. The decision to officially adopt her came a few weeks later. The judge, a surprisingly compassionate man named Taylor, listened to my story, my petition. He watched Shia as she sat on my lap, her small hand holding mine. He asked me a few questions, and I answered them as honestly as I could. "She deserves a chance," I said. "A real chance, I can give her that." The judge looked at me for a long moment. "Mr. Vance," he said, "I've seen a lot of things in my time. I've seen men who claim to care for these children only to see them as cheap labor. You're different. I can see it. I'm going to grant your petition." I felt a wave of emotion so powerful it almost knocked me over. I couldn't speak. I just nodded, my eyes burning. Shah, now officially Cal's daughter, looked up at me, her eyes full of a quiet, steady trust. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She just gave my hand a small, reassuring squeeze. The years passed. Shah grew up on the ranch. She learned to ride, to wrangle, to speak English as well as anyone. But she never forgot her past, her language, her mother. I made sure of that. I didn't want to erase her history. I wanted to be a part of her future. The land, which had once felt so empty and lonely, now felt full. The desert, which had whispered secrets of loss and pain, now echoed with the sound of her laughter. The line between us had been blurred. She was my daughter and I was her father. The cowboy who had found a frightened, lost girl in the desert had become her protector, her champion, her home. And the frightened girl had given the lonely rancher a reason to live again. It wasn't a neat, perfect ending. Life rarely is. But it was a good one, a hopeful one. A story of two people, strangers from different worlds, who had found in each other a love that had healed their broken hearts.